The first thing my father said when he saw my photo on the front page of the Washington Post wasn't, "I'm proud of you." It wasn't congratulations. It wasn't even, "How have you been?" Number. He stared at the picture of me standing beside a 4-star Air Force general inside the Pentagon, lowered the newspaper slowly onto the kitchen table, and said to my mother in the kind of voice people use when they realize they may have made a very expensive mistake, "How much money do you think she makes?" My mother went pale. 3 hours later, my phone rang for the first time in 8 months. "Emily," my father said carefully, "we need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." I remember looking down at the screen in silence while rain slid against the windows of my apartment in Arlington. Outside, traffic crawled through the wet streets of Washington like veins pulsing beneath gray skin. Inside my apartment, everything was still except the ticking clock above the kitchen sink and the faint hum of my dryer running in the next room. Family meeting. The same family that once forgot my deployment date. The same family that laughed when I showed up to Thanksgiving in uniform because I had come straight from base. The same family that called me the government daughter like it was some kind of punchline. And suddenly, they wanted a meeting. I almost laughed. Instead, I told him I'll think about it. Then I hung up. But that wasn't where the story started. It started the week before when my mother looked me dead in the eyes and told me not to waste their time with my little soldier ceremony. And somehow, that hurt more than all the years before it. I'm Colonel Emily Carter, 34 years old, United States Air Force. Most people who meet me now assume I was born confident, disciplined, untouchable. That's the funny thing about uniforms. They make people think strength comes naturally. It doesn't. Sometimes strength is just humiliation that survived long enough to harden into silence. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a family that worshipped appearances. My father, Richard Carter, sold commercial insurance for 30 years and believed success should always be visible. Big house, loud opinions, expensive watch, country club membership. If people couldn't see your importance immediately, he assumed you didn't have any. My older brother Daniel inherited that trait like it was family jewelry. Daniel drove luxury cars he couldn't afford and talked about networking like he was running Wall Street instead of flipping half-empty condo units with borrowed money. My mother adored him. Even when he failed, she described it like temporary genius. "He's ambitious," she'd say proudly. Meanwhile, I joined the military at 19 because college wasn't financially realistic, and because secretly I wanted to leave home before I forgot who I was. My father never forgave me for it. "You're too smart for the military," he told me the day I enlisted. "That's where people go when they run out of options." I still remember standing in our driveway with my duffel bag while summer heat rose off the pavement in waves. I wanted him to hug me goodbye. Instead, he checked his watch. That became the pattern of our relationship. Every promotion I earned somehow became smaller when it entered their house. "Captain, that sounds administrative." "Major, so still not a real commander?" "Lieutenant Colonel, I can never keep track of those ranks." And whenever relatives asked what I did, my mother would wave her hand vaguely and say, "Emily works somewhere in military logistics." Somewhere, as if I stocked shelves in a warehouse. What none of them understood was that logistics in the military meant responsibility, pressure, lives. It meant 14-hour days coordinating emergency transport during hurricanes. It meant memorizing supply chains across continents. It meant making decisions while exhausted because people you would never meet depended on you getting things right. But families like mine don't respect invisible labor. They respect status they can brag about at dinner parties. The call about the Pentagon ceremony came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing transportation readiness reports at Andrews Air Force Base. I answered expecting another scheduling update. Instead, a senior general's office informed me I'd been selected for a distinguished service recognition tied to Operation Iron Harbor, a multinational emergency deployment mission we'd coordinated the previous year after catastrophic flooding overseas. The operation had nearly collapsed 3 times. For 11 days, I slept less than 20 hours total while managing cargo reroutes, medical airlift coordination, and equipment transfers through 6 different countries. When it was over, nobody outside the military knew my name. That was normal. But now apparently someone high above me had noticed. The ceremony would take place at the Pentagon the following Friday. For almost an hour after the call, I debated whether to invite my parents. I should have known better. Still, some stupid little part of me, the 19-year-old girl standing in that driveway with a duffel bag, wanted them there. Wanted them to finally see me. So that evening I called. My mother answered on the 3rd ring while some television show played loudly in the background. "Emily, everything okay?" I got invited to a recognition ceremony at the Pentagon next Friday, I said carefully. I thought maybe you and Dad would want to come. Silence. Then a small laugh. Not cruel at first. Just dismissive. A ceremony for what? It's for Operation Iron Harbor. Oh. Another pause. Honey, aren't those military events kind of boring? I felt my grip tighten on the phone. It's important to me. Before she could answer, my father's voice echoed faintly in the background. Who is it? Emily. What does she want? She invited us to some military thing. I heard him scoff. Then my mother came back on the line, her tone changing into that familiar sweetness people use when they think they're being reasonable. Emily, sweetheart, you're just a low-ranking soldier. Don't make us waste time driving all the way to D.C. for some meaningless ceremony. Low-ranking soldier. At 34 years old? After 15 years of service? For a second I couldn't speak. Then my father shouted loudly enough for me to hear without speakerphone. Tell her to call us when she becomes a general. My chest tightened so suddenly it almost felt physical. Not anger. Not yet. Something older than anger. Something heavier. I looked around my apartment after the call ended. The framed commendations on the wall, the deployment coins on my bookshelf, the folded flag inside the glass case near my desk. An entire life. And somehow to them I was still a disappointment wearing camouflage. That night I barely slept. By morning something inside me had gone quiet. Not broken. Just finished. Finished trying to earn affection from people who treated love like a performance review. Friday arrived cold and bright. Washington carried that sharp winter air that makes every breath feel cleaner than it really is. Black SUVs lined the Pentagon entrance while officers in dress uniforms crossed the courtyard with measured precision. I stood alone near the security checkpoint adjusting my service jacket while sunlight flashed across the silver eagle on my shoulder. No family. No congratulations. Just me. Oddly enough, that made breathing easier. As I walked toward the entrance, I caught my reflection briefly in the dark glass doors. For the first time in years, I stopped wishing my parents could see what I saw. A woman who had built herself from nothing they ever gave her. And as the Pentagon rose around me like a fortress of steel and history, I quietly told myself something I should have admitted long ago. For once, I was done begging to be seen. The Pentagon has a certain sound when you walk through it in dress uniform. Leather soles against polished floors. Quiet conversations cut short when senior officers pass. The distant hum of security doors opening and closing. Everything controlled. Everything measured. I had spent years inside military facilities, but that morning felt different. Not because I was nervous. Because for the first time in my career, people kept stopping me to say thank you. A colonel from Transportation Command shook my hand outside the corridor leading to the ceremony hall. Heard what you did during Iron Harbor, he said. A lot of people made it home because you kept that operation alive. I nodded politely, but his words stayed with me. A lot of people made it home. That was the thing civilians rarely understood about military logistics. Nobody noticed us when we succeeded. But if we failed, people died quietly and far away from cameras. The ceremony room itself wasn't enormous. No dramatic movie-style ballroom. Just a formal Pentagon conference hall with rows of seats, American flags positioned with mathematical precision, and senior officers moving through the crowd with restrained authority. I found my assigned seat near the front. Colonel Carter. I turned and saw Brigadier General Howard Reeves approaching me with an easy smile. I recognized him immediately. He'd overseen part of the European coordination during Iron Harbor. Sir. At ease, he said softly. You look surprised to be here. A little, sir? He laughed quietly. That means you're probably the right person for the award. Then his expression shifted. Most people in this building know Iron Harbor almost collapsed halfway through. I remembered that night instantly. 3 countries refusing clearance approval. Weather shutting down routes. Medical shipments stranded overseas. 47 minutes from complete operational failure. I had stood in a temporary command room at Ramstein Air Base with bloodshot eyes and coffee-stained paperwork, while half the senior staff argued over protocol. And eventually I'd ignored protocol. I rerouted aircraft without waiting for full authorization. Risked my career. Saved the mission. General Reeves lowered his voice slightly. You made decisions most officers would have been too afraid to make. Sir, I just did my job. No, he said firmly, you did more than that. Before I could respond, another officer approached him and he gave me one final nod before walking away. I sat there afterward staring at the folded program in my lap. For years, my family had reduced my career to jokes about paperwork and uniforms. Meanwhile, strangers inside the Pentagon understood exactly what I had carried. The ceremony began promptly at 10. Medals, citations, formal introductions. Then my name was called. Colonel Emily Carter. I stood, smoothed my jacket instinctively, and walked toward the stage beneath the bright overhead lights. The room blurred slightly around the edges the way it always did during emotionally significant moments. Not panic, just adrenaline narrowing the world. I remember hearing fragments as the citation was read aloud. Exceptional leadership. Critical international coordination. Directly responsible for successful medical evacuation operations. Saved countless civilian and military lives. Then came the handshake. General Thomas Whitaker, 4-Star Air Force Command. A man whose face appeared regularly on national news. He held my hand firmly and looked directly at me before leaning closer. The military needs more officers like you, Colonel. Simple sentence. But after a lifetime of being treated invisible by my own family, those words landed somewhere deep. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. And for the first time since I joined the Air Force, I allowed myself one dangerous thought. Maybe I had finally become someone impossible to dismiss. After the ceremony ended, several journalists from military publications gathered near the reception area. Normally, I avoided media attention whenever possible, but protocol required brief interviews. One reporter asked, "What motivated you during Iron Harbor?" I answered honestly. People were depending on us. Once you understand that clearly enough ego disappears, you just focus on bringing everyone home. Another asked whether leadership came naturally to me. I almost laughed. No, I said. Leadership usually comes from surviving difficult people. The reporter smiled politely, assuming I meant military pressure. I let him believe that. By late afternoon, I returned to my apartment exhausted but strangely calm. The city outside glowed gold beneath the setting sun while traffic rolled slowly past the Potomac. I changed out of my uniform, carefully hanging the jacket with practiced precision before loosening my collar and sitting on the couch in silence. No celebration dinner, no family waiting, just quiet. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Around 7 that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an old family friend named Carol Simmons. "Saw your photo online. Your parents must be so proud." I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. That word again. Proud. People assumed parents naturally became proud once success became visible enough. They didn't understand that some families resent your success more than your failure, especially when your success exposes how badly they underestimated you. The next morning, everything exploded. I woke to 17 missed calls, 3 voicemails, 9 text messages. My first thought was that something terrible had happened. Then I opened one of the messages from my cousin Natalie. "Emily, are you at the Pentagon right now?" Underneath it was a photograph. The Washington Post. Front section. And there I was, standing beside General Whitaker in full dress uniform, while both of us faced the cameras beneath the Pentagon seal. The headline read, "Colonel Emily Carter honored for strategic leadership during international crisis response." Colonel, not low-ranking soldier. Not Emily who works somewhere in logistics. Colonel Emily Carter. I sat very still at the edge of my bed while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Then my phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded different immediately. Careful. Measured. The way people speak when they suddenly realize they may not fully understand the person on the other end. Emily. Dad. Long pause. We saw the article. I figured. Another pause. Your parents spend your entire childhood teaching you to recognize emotional shifts in their voices. Even after years apart, I could hear everything underneath his silence. Confusion. Embarrassment. Calculation. You never told us, he began slowly. Told you what? That you were, he hesitated, important. I nearly smiled at that word. Important. As if value only became real after newspapers printed it. I tried inviting you to the ceremony. That's not what I mean. Of course it wasn't. Because what bothered him wasn't missing the event. It was discovering other people respected me more than he did. Behind him, I could hear my mother speaking rapidly in the background. Ask her if that general knows senators. Richard, ask her if she's on television again tonight. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not love. Opportunity. My father cleared his throat. Your mother and I think maybe we should all sit down together. Why? We're family. Funny how that word only appeared when my status became useful. I walked toward the kitchen window while holding the phone. Outside, Arlington moved normally beneath gray skies. Joggers passed on sidewalks. Cars stopped at intersections. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed faintly. Ordinary life continuing while my family suddenly rewrote who they thought I was. "We need to talk," my father said again. "Family meeting tomorrow." I leaned one shoulder against the window frame. 8 months earlier, I'd called home during Christmas leave. Nobody answered because Daniel had apparently rented a lake house for the family and forgotten to mention the trip to me. Now they wanted a meeting, because a newspaper told them I mattered. When I asked quietly, relief flooded his voice immediately. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'll see if I can make it. Emily," his tone softened carefully, "we're proud of you." The words should have meant something. Instead, they felt late. Very late. After we hung up, I stood motionless in my kitchen for a long time. Then I walked into my spare room and unlocked a small black fireproof box inside the closet. Folders. Financial documents, wire transfer records, medical payment receipts, 12 years of secrets. I carried one black folder back to the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Every hidden thing I'd done for them sat inside those pages. Things they never noticed, never questioned, never thanked me for. And as rain began tapping softly against the windows again, I realized something with absolute clarity. Tomorrow wasn't going to be a reunion. It was going to be an awakening. My parents' house looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. The white colonial home in Richmond had once felt enormous when I was a child. A place where every room carried rules, expectations, tensions you learned to navigate quietly if you wanted peace. But when I pulled into the driveway the next afternoon, the house suddenly looked like what it really was. A carefully maintained shell full of people terrified of appearances cracking. My father's BMW sat in the driveway beside Daniel's black Range Rover, the one he absolutely could not afford. Fresh mulch had been spread around the flower beds recently. My mother always panic cleaned when she wanted to impress people. Apparently now I qualified as people. I stayed in the car for almost a minute after turning off the engine. Rain clouds hung low over Richmond, heavy and gray, making the neighborhood feel muted. I could see movement through the front curtains. They were watching for me. That alone almost made me laugh. When I was younger, they never watched for me. Not after deployments. Not after training exercises. Not even after my first overseas assignment. But today they were waiting at the window. I stepped out wearing civilian clothes instead of my uniform dark jeans, black coat hair tied neatly back. I'd considered arriving in dress blues, then decided against it. I didn't need the uniform anymore. The newspaper had already done the talking for me. Before I even reached the porch, the front door swung open. "Emily," my mother said brightly. Too brightly. She moved toward me quickly, arms half open, as if we were the kind of family that hugged naturally. I noticed the slight hesitation when I didn't immediately move closer, so she awkwardly touched my arm instead. "You made it." "Looks that way." Behind her, my father appeared in the hallway wearing one of his expensive golf sweaters. Daniel stood farther back near the dining room entrance, holding a coffee mug. All three of them looked at me differently now. Not warmer, just more careful. Like investors studying a stock they may have underestimated. Dad stepped forward first. "You look good." "I'm alive, that usually helps." He forced a chuckle. No one else laughed. The smell inside the house hit me immediately, coffee lemon furniture polish and the faint scent of my mother's vanilla candles. The exact same smell from 20 years ago. Funny how memory works. Sometimes scent travels deeper than emotion. "Come sit," Mom said quickly. I made lunch. Of course she had. Because now there was something to gain from hospitality. We moved into the dining room where the table had been fully set like it was Thanksgiving instead of a tense family meeting nobody wanted to define honestly. Daniel leaned back in his chair with an uncomfortable smile. "So, Colonel Carter." There was teasing in his tone, but weaker than before. I sat across from him calmly. "Still sounds strange when you say it." His jaw tightened slightly. "Good." For years, Daniel had treated me like background noise at family gatherings. He interrupted me, constantly mocked military life, once asked whether I was basically a glorified airport manager. Now suddenly he couldn't maintain eye contact. Dad cleared his throat. "Well, first things first." He folded his hands together. "Your mother and I want to say we're proud of you." There it was again. That word. Proud. I looked at him carefully. When did that start? Silence settled heavily across the table. My mother jumped in too quickly. "Oh, Emily, don't do that." "Do what?" "Be difficult." I almost smiled. Interesting. They had ignored me for years, but the moment I stopped pretending not to notice, I became difficult. Dad exhaled slowly. We didn't realize how significant your role was. You didn't ask. That's not fair. No, I leaned back slightly. You called my Pentagon ceremony meaningless. Mom looked embarrassed for exactly 2 seconds before defensiveness returned. Well, we thought you were exaggerating. That sentence landed harder than she intended. Because she truly meant it. My own family genuinely believed I wasn't capable of becoming important. Daniel rubbed his neck awkwardly. To be fair, Em, you never talked much about your career. I looked directly at him. Every time I tried, you changed the subject back to yourself. His face reddened immediately. Dad cut in before Daniel could answer. The point is, things are different now. And there it was. The real conversation finally entering the room. Different now. Not because they suddenly loved me more. Because my value had changed. I stayed quiet and let him continue. He glanced briefly toward my mother before speaking carefully. Your article opened some doors. What kind of doors? Well, he shifted in his chair. People pay attention to military leadership, government connections, influence. I could almost hear the script forming in his head. Mom reached for her coffee cup. Your cousin Natalie said you probably know senators now. Of course she did. I stared at them for several seconds. Then I asked quietly, why am I really here? Nobody answered immediately. Daniel looked down at the table. That told me everything. Finally, Dad sighed heavily. Daniel's company has been struggling. There it was. The truth. Daniel sat up defensively. The market shifted. No, I said calmly. You over-leveraged bad properties during inflated pricing. His eyes snapped toward me. You don't know anything about real estate. No, but I know how numbers work. Dad raised a hand quickly. Emily, we're just asking for guidance. What kind of guidance? Another pause. Then my father said the sentence I had expected from the moment the phone rang yesterday morning. We were hoping maybe you could help. Not emotionally, financially, socially, strategically. Whatever benefited them most. Mom leaned forward with sudden enthusiasm. You probably know people in Washington, important people. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. That seemed to offend her. What's funny? You still don't care what I actually do. Dad frowned. That's not true. Really, I opened my bag slowly and removed the black folder. Then let's test that. The room changed immediately. My father stared at the folder. What's that? I placed it carefully on the table between us. 12 years. Daniel frowned. What? 12 years of things none of you noticed. I opened the folder. The first paper was a bank statement. My mother looked confused until I slid it toward her. Then her face drained of color. That's... Her voice faltered. Our mortgage account. Yes. Dad grabbed the paper. I watched realization begin creeping slowly across his face. Monthly payments. Anonymous transfers. Dates stretching back years. His eyes widened. What is this? The house almost went into foreclosure in 2015, I said quietly. You remember that? Nobody spoke. Of course they remembered. Dad had blamed the economy for months afterward. What you didn't know, I continued, was that the bank received enough money to stop the process 2 days before legal seizure. Mom stared at me. I nodded once. Daniel shook his head slowly. That's impossible. No, what's impossible is believing nobody in this family ever wondered how things magically worked out. I pulled out another document. Hospital payment records. My mother's surgery from 3 years earlier. The insurance gap they thought had mysteriously disappeared. Dad's hands actually trembled now. You paid for this. For all of it. Silence. Heavy. Humiliating silence. I looked at each of them carefully before speaking again. For 12 years, the low-ranking soldier you were embarrassed by quietly kept this family financially alive. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. My father looked older suddenly. Smaller. We didn't know. The words came out cracked and weak. And for the first time in my life, I finally said the thing sitting inside me for years. You never cared enough to know. Mom's eyes filled instantly. Daniel looked physically sick. But I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange part. Anger requires hope. And somewhere over the years, hope had simply worn out. Dad swallowed hard. Emily, we're family. I closed the folder slowly. No, I said softly. Family doesn't wait for newspapers to tell them someone matters. Then I stood. Nobody tried to stop me immediately. I think they were too stunned. At the front door, I finally heard my father's voice behind me. Small. Fragile. Emily. I turned slightly. For a moment he looked less like the intimidating man from my childhood, and more like an aging father realizing too late that he had spent years looking past his own daughter. I really didn't know he whispered. I held his gaze. I know. Then I walked out into the cold Virginia rain and closed the door behind me. For 3 days after I left my parents' house, nobody called. Not my mother. Not Daniel. Not my father. That silence should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. It followed me around my apartment like a second shadow. I would be making coffee before sunrise and suddenly I'd hear my father's voice in my head. I really didn't know. I believed him. That was the worst part. He really hadn't known. Not because the truth had been hidden too well, but because I had been hidden in plain sight. At work, I buried myself in routine. Reports, briefings, budget reviews, meetings where people used words like readiness posture and deployment windows with the seriousness of surgeons discussing vital organs. Military life had a mercy to it when the mission started. Your feelings had to stand quietly in the hallway and wait. But they never left. On the 4th day, my phone began vibrating while I was leaving base. Daniel. I watched his name flash across the screen until the call disappeared. Then it came again. And again. By the time I reached my car, he had left a voicemail. I played it only after sitting behind the wheel with the door shut. Look, I don't know what Dad told you, but things are bad. Really bad. I've got people breathing down my neck, and if this company collapses, Mom and Dad are going to get dragged into it too. I know we've had our issues, but you have connections now. You can make one call. One call, Emily. He paused, breathing hard. Then his voice sharpened. Don't punish everyone just because you're mad. I deleted the message. Not because it didn't hurt. Because it sounded exactly like him. Daniel never asked forgiveness before asking for help. He simply placed his emergency in your lap and acted offended if you refused to carry it. That evening my mother texted, "Honey, your brother is under terrible stress. Please don't turn your back on family now." I stared at the word family until the letters stopped looking real. Family? The same word they used to excuse neglect. The same word they used to demand sacrifice. The same word they never seemed to apply when I was the one standing alone. I didn't answer. A week later, Richard Carter came to Arlington. No warning. No appointment. Just a quiet knock at my apartment door at 7:16 on a Thursday evening. When I opened it, my father stood in the hallway wearing a wool coat and holding his hat in both hands. He looked tired. Not dramatic, not broken in some theatrical way. Just tired like a man who had driven 90 miles with too many thoughts and no good ones. "Emily," he said. I didn't invite him in immediately. He noticed. His eyes lowered for a second. "I know I should have called. Yes, I wanted to see you. I almost said why now, but I already knew why. So I stepped aside." He entered slowly as if crossing into unfamiliar territory. In a way he was. My father had never visited my apartment before. He had never asked what it looked like, never wondered where I spent my evenings, never seen the life I built after leaving his house. His eyes moved across the room. The framed commendation near the bookshelf. The photograph of my unit in Germany. The folded flag in the glass case that belonged to Master Sergeant Elaine Brooks, my first mentor who died of cancer 5 years after retirement and had no children of her own. She'd left it to me because, in her words, I was stubborn enough to understand what it meant. Dad stopped in front of that case. Whose flag? Someone who treated me like family. The sentence landed quietly, but I saw it hit him. He looked away. For a while, neither of us spoke. I made coffee because silence needed something ordinary inside it. My father sat at my small kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, though he didn't drink. "This is a nice place," he said finally. "It's mine." He nodded. I knew he heard the second meaning. Mine, not yours, not Daniel's, not something I built to impress you. "I drove past the Pentagon on the way here," he said. I'd never been that close. I leaned against the counter. "It's just a building." "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." That surprised me. He stared into his coffee like the answer might be floating there. I spent my life thinking success had a certain look. A firm handshake, a nice car, people laughing at your jokes because they needed something from you. A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. "I thought Daniel had it. I thought you were hiding from the real world." I said nothing. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I could remember, my father didn't seem to be performing authority. He just looked old. I was wrong. Those 3 words should have felt satisfying. They didn't. They felt late, like flowers sent to a house after everyone had moved away. "Daniel wants me to help," I said. "I know." So do you? His face tightened. A part of me did. At least it was honest. And now, he looked toward the flag case again. Now I think saving him one more time might be the cruelest thing anyone could do. That was the first decent thing he'd said in years. I folded my arms not defensively but to keep myself steady. I'm cutting off everything. The transfers, the medical gaps, the emergency payments, all of it. He closed his eyes briefly. My voice stayed calm. I won't use my name, my rank, or my reputation to rescue Daniel's business. I won't call senators, I won't pressure anyone. And I won't be the family bank anymore. When he opened his eyes, they were wet, not enough to spill over, but enough. I understand. No, I said, you accept it. Understanding may take longer. He flinched slightly but nodded. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. The old Richard Carter would have. He would have called me cold, ungrateful, dramatic. He would have reminded me who paid for my braces, who kept a roof over my head, who taught me to ride a bike on a cracked suburban sidewalk. But this man stayed quiet. Maybe that was his first attempt at respect. When he finally stood to leave, it had started raining outside. The same soft Virginia rain that seemed to appear every time my life changed shape. At the door, he turned back. I thought success looked different, he said. I held the door open. That's because you only respected what people could brag about at dinner. His jaw worked once like he'd swallowed something sharp. Then he nodded. Outside, he stepped into the hallway, paused, and looked at me one last time. Not at my apartment. Not at the awards. At me. I'm sorry, Emily. I wanted that to fix something. I really did. But some apologies arrive carrying no tools. They can stand beside the damage, but they can't rebuild the house. I know, I said. He walked away slowly, and as I closed the door, I realized my revenge had never been about destroying them. It was this: letting them live without the daughter they only valued after losing access to her. A year later, my name appeared in the news again. Not the front page this time. Just a small military publication article most people would never read unless they already cared about that world. There was a photograph of me standing at a podium during a leadership symposium at Joint Base Andrews, speaking to a room full of young officers. The headline read, Colonel Emily Carter launches mentorship initiative for first-generation military leaders. I didn't send the article to my family. I didn't need to. By then, silence had become easier. Not painless. Just easier. Daniel's company collapsed in early spring. I heard about it from my cousin Natalie, who sent one careful text that began with, I don't want to get involved, but I thought you should know. That was how family gossip always arrived. Wrapped in fake concern delivered with perfect aim. Daniel lost the Range Rover first. Then the office downtown. Then the house he had insisted was an investment property with lifestyle flexibility, which was just his way of saying he couldn't afford it. My mother called twice after that. I didn't answer. She left one voicemail that lasted nearly 4 minutes. I listened to half of it while sitting in my car outside base. Her voice trembled, but not in the way I used to imagine when I was younger. Back then, I thought if my mother ever cried over me, it would feel like proof that I mattered. Instead, it sounded complicated. Emily, I know things haven't been easy between us, she said. But Daniel is still your brother. Your father barely sleeps. This whole situation has been very hard on everyone. Everyone. That was the part that made me press stop. Because even after everything, she still could not say what had been hard on me. That night, I deleted the voicemail and slept 6 straight hours for the first time in weeks. Healing didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like no longer explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. My father was different. He didn't call often, maybe once every 2 months, sometimes less. The calls were short, quiet, almost formal. How are you, he would ask. Busy, I'd say. Are you eating? Yes. Good. At first, I assumed he was building toward another request. He wasn't. That made the calls stranger. Then one afternoon in October, a letter arrived at my apartment. Real paper, cream envelope, my name written in my father's careful handwriting. I stood near the mailboxes for several seconds before opening it. Inside was one folded sheet. No long speech. No demand. No guilt. Just a few lines. Emily, I spent your whole life waiting for you to become someone important. I never realized you already were. I am sorry I made you prove what I should have known. Dad. I read it twice. Then a third time. The hallway around me blurred slightly, but I didn't cry. Not the way people expect in stories. There was no dramatic breakdown, no collapse against the wall. I simply folded the letter carefully and carried it upstairs. For 3 days it sat on my kitchen table beside my keys. I would glance at it in the morning while drinking coffee, see it again at night when I came home exhausted. Each time I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the first honest shape of grief. Because that was what people rarely told you. Sometimes when your family finally admits the truth, it doesn't erase the pain. It confirms it. It tells the younger version of you, the one who waited in driveways and airport terminals and quiet holiday corners, that she wasn't imagining it. She really had been overlooked. She really had been wounded. And she really had survived. The following month, I attended a military memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills like silent witnesses. A bugle played in the distance, its notes thin and aching under the pale winter sky. After the service, a young lieutenant approached me near the path. She couldn't have been more than 24. Dark hair pulled into a strict bun, dress uniform immaculate, eyes trying very hard not to look lost. "Colonel Carter." "Yes," she swallowed. "I heard you speak at Andrews, about leading when your family doesn't understand your service." I waited. Her hands tightened around her gloves. "My father thinks I'm wasting my life." There it was, the same old wound wearing a younger face. I looked at her, and for a moment I saw myself at 19 standing in my parents' driveway, with a duffel bag waiting for a hug that never came. So I said the thing no one had said to me then. Your life does not become smaller because someone else refuses to recognize its size. Her eyes filled, but she nodded quickly, trying to stay composed. I smiled gently. You don't have to convince everyone you matter. Just make sure you never forget it yourself. She thanked me and walked away toward the parking area, shoulders just a little straighter. That was when I understood what the real ending was. It wasn't my father's apology. It wasn't Daniel losing everything. It wasn't my mother finally realizing the daughter she dismissed had been holding the family together all along. The real ending was this. I had become the person I needed when I was younger. And maybe that was better than revenge. Months later, my father asked if he could attend one of my public ceremonies. I thought about saying no. The old part of me wanted to. But another part, older and calmer now, understood that boundaries didn't always require locked doors. Sometimes they required open doors with clear lines painted on the floor. So I said, you can come, but you come as a guest, not as someone owed a place. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I understand. This time I believed he was beginning to. At the ceremony, he sat in the second row, alone. No mother, no Daniel, no performance. When my name was called, I walked across the stage beneath the bright lights, accepted the citation, shook hands with another general, and turned toward the audience. My father was standing, not clapping wildly, not trying to draw attention, just standing straight, one hand pressed over his heart. For once he saw me, just not soon enough to be the reason I became strong, and maybe that was okay. Because I had stopped needing my family to prove my worth. I had already lived it. If this story touched something in you, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to become strong without the support you deserved. There are more stories like this waiting for you every day, so subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Sometimes the people who were overlooked the longest are the ones with the most powerful stories to tell. The pounding on the front door sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. Police opened the door. My father froze in the middle of lifting his coffee mug. My brother Jason looked up from the couch so fast he nearly dropped his phone. The television was still running some sports commentary in the background, loud enough to make the silence afterward feel sharp. Then came another bang. Mr. Frank Carter, open the door now. I stood near the kitchen doorway in my gray army sweatshirt, saying nothing. The smell of stale beer still lingered from the night before. My father slowly turned his head toward me, and for the first time in years, I watched uncertainty crawl across his face. What did you do? He whispered. I didn't answer, because 24 hours earlier he had stood in this same kitchen smiling, while he told me he had sold the military medal my grandfather gave me before he died. A medal that carried 30 years of sacrifice. A medal soaked in history. A medal that never belonged to him. He had laughed when I stared at the empty wooden box in my hands. Family sacrifices for each other, he'd said. Then he took another sip of whiskey, like what he'd done was normal. Like betrayal was some kind of parenting style. Another violent knock shook the door. Jason stood up now, panic already rising in his voice. Dad, why are cops here? But my father kept staring at me, and slowly the smile disappeared from his face. Because after 34 years of being the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the one who cleaned up everybody else's disasters. I had finally stopped sacrificing myself for this family, and my father had no idea what that was going to cost him. When I first came home from Kuwait, people kept telling me how lucky I was. You finally get to rest. Bet it feels good being home. Your father must be proud. That last one always sat strangely in my chest, because pride was never something my father gave freely, especially not to me. My brother Jason got pride. Jason got excuses. Jason got second chances, third chances, fourth chances. Jason got celebrated for surviving disasters he created himself. I got expectations. I pulled my truck into my father's driveway 3 weeks before everything exploded. The old house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint was peeling around the porch rails, and one of the shutters hung crooked beside the upstairs window. My mother used to keep flower pots lined across the front steps every spring. After she died, the porch looked empty all year long. Dad opened the door before I even reached it. "Well," he said, looking me up and down, "Army finally let you go." I smiled faintly. Temporary leave. He stepped aside to let me in. No hug, no warmth, just the smell of black coffee, old leather furniture, and the television already too loud. Jason was asleep on the couch at 2 in the afternoon. Beer cans sat on the coffee table beside betting slips and crumpled fast food wrappers. His boots were still on. One arm hung over his eyes dramatically, like he'd survived combat instead of another gambling binge. Dad lowered his voice. "Rough week for him." I stared at my brother for a second. "Looks exhausting." Dad ignored the tone. That was how things worked in our family. Jason made messes. Everyone else adjusted around them. Growing up, I used to think maybe if I worked harder, Dad would finally look at me the way he looked at Jason. Maybe if I got better grades. Maybe if I stayed out of trouble. Maybe if I joined the army. But people like my father didn't admire discipline. They admired need. Jason always needed something, and my father built his entire identity around rescuing him. The only person who ever really saw me was my grandfather, General Robert Carter. Even now, years after his death, people in town still talked about him like a legend. Decorated war hero, brilliant commander, a man with impossible standards and terrifying presence. But with me, he was patient, calm, kind. When I was 12, he taught me how to shine shoes properly because he said discipline begins with details nobody notices. When I enlisted, he was the only person in the family who looked genuinely proud. The last real conversation we had happened 6 months before he died. I was already overseas by then. We sat together on the back porch while cicadas screamed through the Georgia heat. His breathing had grown weaker, but his eyes were still sharp. He handed me a small wooden box. Inside was his bronze star medal. I immediately shook my head. "Grandpa, I can't take this." "Yes, you can. It belongs in the family." He looked directly at me then. "It belongs to the only person in this family who understands what sacrifice actually means." I still remember how heavy the medal felt in my hand. Not because of the medal, because of what it meant to him. Then he said something I didn't fully understand until years later. "Emily, don't ever let people use the word family to steal your self-respect." Back then I thought he was talking about the military, or leadership, or loyalty. I didn't realize he was warning me about my own father. The first week home was manageable. Jason avoided me most of the time unless he needed money for gas or cigarettes. Dad pretended everything was normal. I helped around the house, fixed the porch railing, replaced a leaking pipe under the sink. It almost felt peaceful sometimes. Then the phone calls started. At first, Dad would step outside to answer them. Then he started yelling. One night I heard him slam the kitchen counter hard enough to rattle dishes. "You'll get your damn money." When he turned around and saw me standing there, his entire face tightened. "What?" I folded my arms. "Who keeps calling? Nobody you need to worry about." But I already knew. Jason came stumbling into the kitchen an hour later, smelling like whiskey and sweat. He grabbed orange juice straight from the carton and avoided eye contact. "How much?" I asked quietly. He stopped drinking. Dad immediately snapped Emily. But I kept staring at Jason. "How much do you owe?" Jason laughed nervously. "It's complicated." "That means a lot." Silence. Then Dad exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. 70,000. The number hit the room like shattered glass. I stared at him. "You're kidding." "It got out of hand," Jason muttered. "You think?" Dad stepped closer to me now, already preparing the speech I'd heard my entire life. "Your brother made mistakes, but family helps each other." There it was. The Carter family religion. Not accountability. Not responsibility. Sacrifice. Usually mine. Dad sat down slowly across from me. You've got savings, military benefits, steady income. I almost laughed. You want me to pay $70,000? It's not forever, he said quickly, just until Jason gets back on his feet. Jason nodded eagerly like this was completely reasonable. And something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly enough that I knew nothing would ever be the same after this moment. I looked at my father for a long time before speaking. Number? Dad blinked. Jason frowned. What do you mean no? I mean I'm not paying your debt. The room turned still. Dad's voice hardened immediately. After everything this family's done for you. I almost asked him what exactly that was. The silence stretched between us like a wire ready to snap. Then my father stood up slowly. Family sacrifices for each other, Emily. I met his eyes calmly. No, I said softly. Family isn't supposed to destroy one person to save another. The next morning I woke before sunrise the way I always did. Military habits don't leave just because you hang up the uniform for a few weeks. My eyes opened at 0500 sharp and immediate, before the alarm even had a chance to vibrate on the nightstand. For a few seconds I lay there listening to the old house breathe around me. The pipes knocked somewhere behind the wall. A truck passed outside its tires hissing against damp pavement. From downstairs came the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint, uneven snore of my brother on the couch. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the night before. $70,000. That number still sat in my mind like a stone. I had money saved. Not because life had been easy, but because I'd spent years living out of duffel bags, eating in chow halls, missing birthdays, funerals, holidays, and ordinary Sundays that other people took for granted. I had earned every dollar in that account, one deployment, one missed Christmas, one aching night at a time. Jason had earned his debt at sports bars and backroom poker games. And somehow in my father's mind, those two things belonged on the same scale. I pushed the blanket off and sat up. The room still looked like it had when I was 17, except colder. My old track ribbons were gone, but the nail holes remained above the dresser. A cardboard box of my mother's things sat in the corner untouched since the funeral. On top of the dresser was the small wooden box my grandfather had given me. I always checked it when I came home. Not because I thought anyone would touch it. Because seeing it steadied me. I crossed the room barefoot, lifted the box gently, and ran my thumb over the carved initials on the lid, R.C. Robert Carter. My grandfather's hands had been old and trembling when he gave it to me, but his voice had still carried command. Don't ever let people use the word family to steal your self-respect. I opened the lid. The box was empty. At first, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. I stood perfectly still, staring into the velvet lining where the bronze star had rested for years. The indentation was still there, a faint outline in dark blue fabric. But the metal itself was gone. For one strange suspended moment, I thought maybe I had moved it. Maybe I had taken it out and forgotten. Maybe I'd packed it somewhere safer. Then I saw the dust mark, a clean rectangle on the dresser where the box had been shifted and placed back carelessly. My body went cold before my thoughts caught up. I walked out of the room with the box in my hand. Downstairs, Dad was in the kitchen pouring coffee. Jason was awake too, hunched over the table with bloodshot eyes, scrolling through his phone like a man waiting for a verdict. Dad saw the box first. Then he saw my face. He didn't look surprised. That told me everything. Where is it? I asked. Jason glanced up, then looked away fast. Dad took a sip of coffee. Morning to you too. Where is it? He set the mug down with exaggerated patience, like I was a child making noise before breakfast. Emily, lower your voice. I stepped into the kitchen. The house smelled like burned coffee and old grease. Morning light cut through the blinds in thin yellow stripes across the table. Jason's knee bounced under it. I held up the box. Where is my grandfather's medal? My father sighed. Not guilty. Not ashamed. Annoyed. I sold it. The words landed so cleanly, so simply that for a second I didn't move. Jason kept staring at his phone. I heard the clock above the stove tick once. Then again. You what? Dad leaned back against the counter. I sold it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the box. That wasn't yours. It was in my house. It was mine. It was your grandfather's, he corrected sharply. And before you start acting dramatic, he was my father. I stared at him. I had seen men lie under pressure. I had seen soldiers panic. I had seen commanders make terrible decisions and still try to stand tall afterward. But this was different. This was a man who had convinced himself that theft was leadership. "You sold a military decoration," I said slowly, "that was legally given to me." Dad waved his hand. "Don't start with all that legal nonsense. Some collector offered good money for it." "How much?" He hesitated. That hesitation hurt almost as much as the act itself. "How much?" I repeated. 12,000. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You sold my grandfather's bronze star for $12,000. Jason muttered. "It helped." I turned on him. He shrank slightly, but not enough. "It helped," I said. "You owed $70,000 and he sold the one thing Grandpa left me so you could cover what interest?" Jason's face reddened. "You don't know what kind of pressure I'm under." "No," I said. "I know exactly what pressure is. Pressure is calling home from a desert base and pretending you're fine so your family doesn't worry. Pressure is standing in formation beside an empty pair of boots. Pressure is earning something you can't buy." Dad slammed his mug down. "That's enough." But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at the empty box. I could feel my grandfather's absence in it. That was the only way I can describe it. Some objects hold weight beyond their size. That metal had held his voice, his hand on my shoulder, his belief in me when nobody else in that house cared enough to look. And my father had traded it away like a watch at a pawn shop. Finally, I looked back at him. "Who bought it?" Dad's jaw tightened. "None of your business. It became my business when you stole from me." His eyes flashed. "Don't you stand in my kitchen and call me a thief. Then don't steal." Jason pushed back from the table. "Emily, come on. Dad was just trying to help." I turned toward him fully. "No, Dad was trying to avoid letting you face consequences." Dad pointed at me. "You think that uniform makes you better than us?" I said nothing. "You think because you got medals and a salary and everybody claps when you walk through airports, you don't owe this family anything?" My throat tightened, but my voice stayed even. "I owe this family honesty. I owe basic respect. I don't owe $70,000. And I don't owe silence while you sell what doesn't belong to you." Dad laughed. It was small, bitter, and ugly. "Your grandfather would understand." That was the sentence that almost broke my control. Not the theft. Not the money. That. I stepped closer until only the kitchen table stood between us. "Don't use him to justify this." Dad folded his arms, suddenly looking pleased that he had found the wound. "He knew what sacrifice meant. Maybe you forgot." I watched him smile. Then he said it. "Sacrifice is part of family." Jason looked relieved, like the phrase had settled everything. Dad lifted his coffee again. But I just stood there. No yelling. No crying. No trembling. Something very quiet opened inside me, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel like his daughter. I felt like a witness. I closed the empty box. The sound was soft, but both of them heard it. Dad frowned. "What are you doing?" I turned and walked toward the hallway. "Emily." I kept walking. "Emily, don't be childish." I stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked back. "You should have asked me." Dad scoffed. "And you would have said no." "Yes," I said, "I would have." Then I went upstairs, put on jeans boots and my army field jacket, and carried the wooden box out to the garage. The air inside was cold and smelled like motor oil and dust. I sat behind the wheel of my truck, shut the door, and held the box in my lap. For a moment, I let myself breathe. Not cry. Just breathe. Then I took out my phone and made the call. The first person I contacted was Colonel Denise Whitaker, my commanding officer, and one of the few people I trusted without hesitation. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp even before 6 in the morning. "Carter." "Ma'am," I said. "I need guidance on reporting a stolen military decoration." There was a pause. Then her tone changed. "Whose decoration?" "My grandfather's. General Robert Carter, Bronze Star, transferred to me personally before his death." Another pause, longer this time. "Was it taken from your possession?" "Yes, ma'am." "By whom?" I looked through the windshield at the kitchen window. Dad stood inside talking with Jason, both of them already moving on with their morning like nothing had happened. "My father." Colonel Whitaker exhaled once. "Do you know where it is now?" "Sold to a collector." "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully, Major. You are going to file a police report. You are going to preserve every message, every record, every witness statement. And Emily..." "Yes, ma'am." Her voice softened just slightly. "Do not let them talk you out of this." After I hung up, I sat in the truck for another full minute. Then I called the local police department. The officer on the line asked for my name, the item, the estimated value, and whether I believed the sale had been unauthorized. I answered each question clearly. When he asked if the person responsible was a family member, I looked down at the wooden box. Yes, I said, but that doesn't change what he did. By that evening, my father and brother were drinking beer in the living room. Jason laughed too loudly at something on TV. Dad sat in his recliner acting like the king of a house built on unpaid bills and old resentments. Neither one apologized. Neither one asked if I was okay. To them, my silence meant surrender. They didn't understand that silence can also be preparation. I went to bed with the empty box beside me. And the next morning before the coffee finished brewing, the front door shook under the weight of a fist. Police opened the door, Souther didn't move at first. The knocking came again, harder this time, a flat official sound that seemed to split the house down the middle. "Mr. Carter, this is the police, open the door." Jason stood near the couch with his mouth slightly open, one hand still wrapped around his phone. He looked younger in that moment. Not innocent, just small. All the swagger he carried when asking for money had drained out of him, leaving behind a man who suddenly understood that consequences could have uniforms too. Dad slowly turned from the front door to me. "What did you do?" he asked again. I stood near the hallway with my arms relaxed at my sides. My hair was pulled back. My boots were already on. I had not slept much, but I had slept enough. Enough to know that what was happening was not revenge in the way my father would understand it. It was correction. "I made a report," I said. Dad's face hardened instantly. "You called the cops on your own father." Before I could answer, the officer outside knocked again. "Open the door now." Dad cursed under his breath and walked to the entryway. His shoulders were stiff, his steps heavy, but I could see the hesitation in the way his hand hovered over the lock. He had spent his entire life acting like rules were things that applied to other people. Now the rules were standing on his porch. He opened the door. 2 uniformed officers stood outside. Behind them was a woman in a dark blazer with short gray hair and a badge clipped at her belt. Her posture told me she had been military before she ever introduced herself. Straight spine, calm eyes, no wasted movement. "Frank Carter," one officer asked. Dad lifted his chin. "That's me. I'm Officer Daniels. This is Officer Perez. We need to speak with you regarding a reported theft and unauthorized sale of military property." Dad gave a dry laugh. "Military property. You people must be confused." The woman in the blazer stepped forward. "I don't think we are." Her eyes moved past him and landed on me. "Major Carter." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Special Investigator Helen Reeves. I spoke with Colonel Whitaker this morning." Dad looked between us. "Major Investigator, what the hell is this?" Officer Daniels stepped inside. "May we come in?" Dad started to say no, but then he saw the folder in Investigator Reeves's hand. Something in his expression shifted. Not guilt yet. Just calculation. He stepped back. The living room suddenly looked worse with law enforcement in it. Beer cans on the side table, stained carpet. Jason's bedding slips folded under a coaster. Family pictures on the wall, all of us pretending to be closer than we ever were. Investigator Reeves looked around once, then turned to my father. "Mr. Carter, we're here about a Bronze Star Medal awarded to General Robert Carter and later transferred by signed document to Major Emily Carter." Dad crossed his arms. It was my father's medal. That was not my question. His jaw tightened. Reeves opened the folder. "Did you sell the medal?" Dad glanced at Jason. Jason looked away. That alone was answer enough. Dad cleared his throat. "I sold an old family item, yes. Who did you sell it to?" "A collector." "Name?" "I don't remember." I watched him lie with the same tone he used when telling bill collectors the check was in the mail. Investigator Reeves did not blink. "That's unfortunate because the collector remembers you." For the first time, Jason made a sound, not a word, more like air leaving a punctured tire. Dad's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means Mr. Harold Benson contacted local authorities after learning the medal may have been sold without legal authorization. He also provided a receipt." Dad's face lost a little color. I hadn't expected that. I knew the police would investigate, but I hadn't known the buyer had already cooperated. A strange calm moved through me. Not joy, not satisfaction, just the steady feeling of a door locking behind the truth. Officer Perez pulled a small notebook from her pocket. "Mr. Benson stated you claimed full ownership of the item." Dad's mouth opened, then closed. "He also stated you told him your daughter was deceased." The room went silent. For one moment, even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. Jason whispered, "Dad." I felt something cold move through my chest. Not surprise, worse than surprise. Confirmation. My father had not just sold the metal, he had erased me to make the sale easier. I looked at him waiting for him to deny it. He didn't. He pointed at me instead. She wouldn't help her brother, he said. Jason was in trouble. Real trouble. I did what I had to do. Officer Daniels looked unimpressed. By claiming your living daughter was dead. Dad's eyes flashed. You don't understand family. That sentence almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly him. Investigator Reeves closed the folder halfway. Mr. Carter family does not give you legal ownership over another adult's property. Dad turned toward me, anger rising now because shame had nowhere else to go. You hear that? You happy. You dragged strangers into this house to humiliate me. I took one step forward. No, you did that when you sold what wasn't yours. Jason suddenly found his voice. Emily, come on. This is insane. We can fix this. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I looked at my brother. His hair was messy. His hands shook slightly. He had always been able to become pitiful at exactly the right moment, like a child holding up a broken toy he had smashed himself. A misunderstanding, I asked. He nodded too quickly. Yeah, Dad didn't mean anything bad. He was trying to help me. And that has always been the problem. Jason frowned. I turned to the officers, then back to my father and brother. For years, everything in this family has been renamed to protect Jason. Gambling became stress. Lying became panic. Stealing became sacrifice. And me paying for it became love. Dad barked enough. But I didn't stop. When Jason needed rent, I paid it. When his truck got repossessed, I helped get it back. When Mom was sick and you said you couldn't handle bills alone, I sent money from overseas. I missed her last good Thanksgiving because I was deployed, and still somehow I was the selfish one. My voice did not rise. That made it worse for them. Because every word landed clean. Jason stared at the carpet. Dad's breathing grew heavier. You trained me to believe being a good daughter meant bleeding quietly, I said. But I am not bleeding for this anymore. Investigator Reeves watched me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she turned to my father. Mr. Carter, we need the full details of the sale. Depending on the documentation and intent, this may involve theft, fraud, and filing a false ownership claim. Dad suddenly looked at Officer Daniels. Am I being arrested? Not at this moment, Daniels said, but you are being asked to cooperate. At this moment, Jason repeated weakly. Officer Perez's gaze moved to him. And we'll need to discuss the financial circumstances connected to the sale. Jason swallowed. That was when he understood this was no longer only about the metal. The debt was no longer hidden inside family walls. The calls, the threats, the money, the lies, all of it had stepped into daylight. Dad gripped the back of his recliner. This is a family matter. Investigator Reeves's face remained calm. No, Mr. Carter. It stopped being only a family matter when you sold a military decoration using false information. Then she looked at me. And when the rightful owner chose not to stay silent. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Rain had started outside, tapping softly against the windows. The house smelled of coffee left too long on the burner. Somewhere in that quiet, I remembered my grandfather sitting on the porch telling me that honor was not loud. It was what you did when nobody else wanted the truth spoken. Dad looked at me then, not as his daughter, not as someone he could order around, but as a person with rank records rights and a spine he had mistaken for silence. His mouth twisted. You think your grandfather would be proud of this? Before I could answer, Investigator Reeves did. I never met General Carter personally, she said. But my father did. Iraq, 2004. He told me General Carter pulled 3 men out of a burning convoy and refused to leave until every soldier was accounted for. My father blinked. Reeves held his gaze. My father said he was the kind of man who knew the difference between sacrifice and exploitation. The words settled over the room like a verdict. Dad looked away first. Jason sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, suddenly pale. And I stood there holding an empty wooden box, finally understanding that my grandfather's legacy had never been inside the metal alone. It had been inside the courage to protect it. For the next 3 days, the house felt like a building after a fire. Still standing, but damaged in ways nobody could ignore. My father barely spoke to me unless he absolutely had to. When he did, his voice carried that tight, bitter restraint people use when they know rage won't help them anymore. Jason spent most of his time locked in the basement, pretending he was looking for work, though. Every few hours, another unknown number lit up his phone and sent him pacing like a trapped animal. The police had not arrested anyone yet, but the investigation was active. The collector who bought the metal had surrendered it voluntarily once he realized the ownership papers were fraudulent. Investigator Reeves informed me it would remain in evidence temporarily before being returned. My father called that government nonsense. I called it accountability. But beneath the tension, something else had begun happening inside that house. Fear. Not loud fear. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into the walls when people realize old family patterns no longer work. Dad couldn't order me around anymore. Guilt no longer moved me. Silence no longer protected him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to control the situation. On the fourth morning, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table before sunrise. No television. No coffee. Just him staring at a stack of overdue bills under the yellow light above the stove. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Not physically. Spiritually? Like something foundational inside him had started collapsing. I moved toward the coffee maker quietly, but his voice stopped me. You think you won. I kept my back turned while pouring coffee. This isn't about winning. That's easy to say when everybody's treating you like some hero. I looked over my shoulder. No one's treating me like a hero. He gave a dry laugh. That investigator practically saluted you. She respected the truth. Dad shook his head slowly. No, he muttered. She respected the uniform. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Because part of me knew he believed it. My father had spent his whole life dismissing things he didn't understand. Discipline, boundaries, emotional restraint. To him, authority only mattered when it served him directly. The army represented everything he secretly resented: structure, accountability, consequences. And maybe deep down he hated that I belonged to something bigger than this family. I took my coffee to the table and sat across from him. The rain from yesterday had left the windows fogged pale gray. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started in the distance. Dad rubbed a hand across his jaw. Jason's scared. I stared at him. Not because the statement surprised me. Because even now, after everything, Jason was still the center of gravity in his mind. What about you? I asked quietly. He frowned slightly. What about me? Are you scared? For a second, his eyes flickered. Then pride sealed the crack shut. I'm angry. Of course he was. Anger was easier than guilt. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen wall through the window. A black sedan pulled slowly into the driveway. Dad stiffened immediately. A minute later, there was a knock at the door. Not police this time. Measured, professional. I opened it to find a tall man in a navy overcoat carrying a leather briefcase. Major Carter. Yes. He offered a polite nod. My name is Walter Green. I was General Robert Carter's attorney. Everything inside me went still. Behind me, I heard my father stand up sharply. Green stepped inside, carefully removing rain from his glasses with a folded handkerchief. He looked to be in his late 60s, silver-haired and composed in the way old attorneys often are when they've spent decades watching families tear themselves apart over inheritance. I apologize for arriving unannounced, he said, but recent events made this conversation necessary. Dad folded his arms instantly. What conversation? Mr. Green looked at him evenly. One your father instructed me to have if certain circumstances ever occurred. The kitchen became very quiet. I slowly sat back down. Green opened his briefcase and removed a thick sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Emily. Just seeing it nearly took the air from my lungs. Dad stepped forward. What is that? Green ignored him. Your grandfather left specific instructions regarding his military effects, Major Carter. He was concerned they might eventually become the subject of financial coercion. Dad's face darkened instantly. That old man never trusted his own family. Green finally looked at him directly. With respect, Mr. Carter, he trusted the right people exactly as much as he intended to. That landed harder than shouting would have. Dad's jaw tightened. I picked up the envelope carefully. My grandfather's handwriting looked shakier than I remembered, but unmistakable. Suddenly I could smell his aftershave again. Hear the scrape of his cane across the porch boards. Feel his rough hand against my shoulder. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a letter, and another set of legal documents. My eyes moved first to the letter. Emily, if you are reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either this family has finally asked too much from you, or you have finally stopped giving it. I swallowed hard. Across the table, my father shifted uncomfortably. Your father and brother are not evil people. But weakness repeated long enough becomes cruelty. And the cruelest thing this family ever did to you was convince you that love must always cost you something. The kitchen blurred slightly. I blinked once and kept reading. You were born carrying responsibility that never belonged to you. I watched it happen for years. Every time Jason failed, you were expected to compensate. Every time Frank struggled, you were expected to absorb the damage quietly. That is not sacrifice. That is consumption. Dad suddenly snapped, "What exactly is this supposed to accomplish?" Mr. Green answered calmly, "Your father wanted his granddaughter to understand the truth." "The truth," Dad barked. "The truth is I kept this family together." "No," I said softly before I even realized I was speaking. "You kept finding someone else to carry it." The room fell silent again. I looked back at the letter. "I have paid your father's debts more times than he knows. I covered Jason's mistakes more times than he deserved. But eventually I understood something painful. Rescuing people from consequences only teaches them to keep creating disasters." My hands tightened slightly on the paper. Then I reached the final section. "There is also a trust." My father straightened instantly. Mr. Green opened the second folder. "General Carter established a private trust in Emily's name approximately 8 years ago." Jason appeared silently in the doorway behind us, pale and exhausted. Dad stared at the attorney. "How much?" Green didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. "The trust was never meant to reward service alone," he said carefully. "Your grandfather attached a condition." I frowned. "What condition?" Green's expression softened slightly. "That the funds only transfer fully once you demonstrated the willingness to stop sacrificing your own stability to sustain destructive family patterns." My father let out a sharp laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." But Mr. Green slid the documents across the table anyway. I looked down at the number and suddenly understood why my grandfather had protected it so carefully. It wasn't millionaire fantasy money, but it was enough. Enough to erase every debt I personally carried. Enough to buy a home. Enough to breathe. Jason whispered, "Jesus." Dad looked furious now, but underneath the anger was something uglier. Humiliation. "You planned this," he snapped at me. I looked up slowly. "No, Grandpa did." "He turned you against us." "No," I said quietly. "He tried to save me from becoming responsible for everyone forever." Dad shoved a hand through his hair and paced toward the sink. "All this because I sold some damn metal." "No," Mr. Green corrected gently. "Because the metal revealed the truth." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Jason suddenly grabbed his jacket. "I gotta go." Dad turned sharply. "Where?" Jason avoided everyone's eyes. "Out." "You can't just leave right now." But Jason was already backing toward the door. Because for the first time in his life, there was no one left between him and the consequences waiting outside. The door slammed behind him. Dad looked exhausted suddenly. Old. Smaller than I had ever seen him. And as I sat there holding my grandfather's final letter, I realized something painful. Part of me had spent my entire life waiting for my father to become someone else. Someone softer. Kinder. Fair. But grief has a strange way of clearing illusions. Some people never change. Some people only run out of power. 2 weeks later, the medal came back to me in a padded evidence envelope. Investigator Reeves met me at the police station on a Thursday afternoon, just as the sky was turning the color of old steel. She handed it over with both hands, not because procedure required it, but because she understood what it was. "Mr. Benson signed a statement," she said. "He didn't know it was stolen. Once he realized, he cooperated fully." I nodded. "What happens now?" She studied me for a moment. "That depends partly on the district attorney. Your father may face charges related to theft and fraud. The false ownership claim complicates things." I looked down at the envelope. For a long time I had imagined that getting the medal back would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt heavier than that. Like receiving back a piece of something after someone had tried to prove it could be taken. "Are you all right?" Major Reeves asked. I almost gave the automatic answer. "Yes, ma'am." "Fine, ma'am." Instead, I said, "I don't know yet." She nodded once, like she respected that more than a polished lie. That evening, I drove home slowly. The old neighborhood rolled past my windows, split-level houses, American flags, porch lights glowing in the early dark. A man across the street was dragging his trash cans to the curb. Somewhere, someone was grilling. Ordinary life continued, careless and steady. But my life had shifted. The house was quiet when I walked in. Jason was gone. No one knew exactly where. Dad said he had needed space, but I knew better. The calls had grown more threatening. The men Jason owed had stopped leaving polite messages. He had finally done what he always did when pressure became real. He ran. Dad sat in the living room, the television on mute. His face looked hollow in the blue light. There were unopened envelopes on the coffee table and a glass of whiskey beside his chair. He looked up when I came in. His eyes went immediately to the envelope in my hand. They gave it back. Yes, he swallowed. For a second I thought he might apologize. But pride is a stubborn disease. I hope it was worth it, he said. I stood in the doorway too tired to be angry. That's what you still don't understand, I said. You think this was about punishing you. What else would it be about? I walked to the mantel where an old photograph of my grandfather still stood in a tarnished frame. He was younger in the picture, wearing dress blues, his posture straight, his expression severe. But I remembered the man behind the portrait, the one who slipped peppermints into my coat pocket, the one who watched my track meets even when his knees hurt too badly to climb the bleachers. I opened the envelope and held the medal carefully in my palm. It caught the lamplight in a muted bronze glow. This was about stopping you, I said. Dad's face tightened. Stopping me. Yes, stopping you from deciding that my life, my money, my memories, and my boundaries were all available whenever Jason needed saving. His mouth opened, but no words came. I placed the medal on the mantel beside Grandpa's photograph. For a moment the room felt almost sacred. Then Dad spoke lower this time. I was trying to keep this family together. I turned back to him. No, Dad. You were trying to keep a system together, one where Jason destroys you, excuse, and I repair. He flinched, but I kept my voice calm. I know you loved Mom. I know losing her broke something in you. I know Jason scared you because he was weak in ways you didn't know how to fix. I know maybe helping him made you feel like you still mattered. His eyes reddened slightly. But you turned me into the price. The words sat between us. He looked away first. For the first time I saw not a monster, not a villain, not the giant shadow I had spent years trying to outrun. I saw an aging man who had confused control with love for so long that he no longer knew how to separate them. That did not make what he did acceptable. It only made it sadder. A few days later he came to see me at the small rental house I had taken near base. I had moved out quietly before dawn with 2 duffel bags, my documents, my grandfather's letter, and the medal locked safely in a case. Dad stood on my porch wearing the same brown jacket he had worn to my mother's funeral. He looked uncomfortable there, like a man visiting a country where he didn't speak the language. Can I come in, he asked. I hesitated. Then I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. His face changed when he understood. He wasn't getting access just because he was my father. Not anymore. We stood under the porch light while cold wind moved through the trees. He cleared his throat. Jason called. I said nothing. He's in Tennessee, I think, said he needs help. I watched him carefully. And Dad's jaw worked. I told him I couldn't. That surprised me more than I wanted it to. He looked down at his hands. First time I ever said it. For a moment I saw the cost of it in his face. Not enough to erase the past, not enough to undo the theft, but enough to prove that even men like my father could feel the edge of truth when it finally cut deep. I'm glad, I said softly. His eyes lifted. Does that change anything between us? I took a breath. The answer hurt. Number. He nodded slowly like he had expected it and still hoped he was wrong. I don't know how to fix this, he said. You don't fix it by asking me to come back. I know. You don't fix it by needing forgiveness before you've changed. His shoulders dropped. I know. The wind moved again, carrying the faint smell of pine and distant rain. Then he asked the question I had feared. Can you forgive me? I looked past him toward the dark street. For years I had believed forgiveness meant opening the door again, answering the call, sending the money, pretending the wound had closed because everyone else was tired of looking at it. But that night I finally understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me. Forgiveness is not permission, and peace does not require returning to the place that broke you. I'm working on letting go of what you did, I said, but I'm not giving you my life back. Dad closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked older. I'm sorry, Emily. It was the first real apology I had ever heard from him. No explanation, no accusation, no but, just sorry. I nodded once. Not acceptance, not rejection, just acknowledgement. Then I went back inside and locked the door. Months later, I stood in my new home wearing my dress uniform before a memorial dinner honoring my grandfather's service. The medal rested in a glass case on the wall beside his letter, not hidden in a drawer, not waiting for someone else to decide its worth. Protected. I touched the glass lightly before leaving. For the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty for having peace. I did not feel selfish for having boundaries. And I did not feel cruel for refusing to pay the debts of people who had mistaken my love for an open bank account. My grandfather once told me that honor was not something pinned to your chest. It was something you defended when the people closest to you tried to convince you it was negotiable. He was right. Some families will call your silence loyalty. Some will call your suffering love. Some will steal from you, then accuse you of betrayal when you finally protect yourself. But the day you stop handing them the knife is not the day you become heartless. It is the day you come home to yourself. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to choose peace over family pressure. There are more stories like this coming every day, so subscribe and stay with us. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes it is simply walking away with your dignity still intact.